The sun is shining. Kingfisher has just stopped warbling its little head off, and it's day 113 of my attempt to plant a tree every day for 2023, so it is time for our fortnightly review. Still first up for now, this little Macadamia integrifolia, which just had a lovely little cranefly land on it, has grown in nicely. The new growth seems to have hardened off, and there are a couple of growth points coming. They're not doing much at the moment, but they are there. We have a lovely little Thaumatophyllum bipinnatifidium, which is the tree philodendron, which is looking nice. It is a nice dark colour, and nice and firm, and you can see down in there some new shoots just starting to poke up, which is really good to see. And next up we have our Aloidendron barbary. You can actually see the second of the new leaves since it went in has actually reached the same level as the support stick, which is really good. That's coming up really nicely. And then we have this lovely little Chinese fan palm, Livistone Genesis, which went in as a sabal because it was misidentified at sale. And it's a nice colour. The central leaf is coming up well. It's nice and firm, so I'm happy with that. And here we have our little sabal palmetto, who went in on the same day and is looking pretty good, so I'm happy with that. This has definitely become a palm area because this little Carpentaria is next up, and it's looking reasonable. It hasn't really responded much to going in yet, but the central leaf is still nice and firm, so I'm happy that it's not suffering any real stress. Despite the proximity to chickens, this little lychee seems to be reasonably healthy. There is a little bit of sunburn on here, and there's no sign of new growth, but it doesn't seem stressed in any particular way, so it should be settling in alright at the moment. Our little pink mango does seem to have suffered a little bit, so these leading leaves do seem to have got a little bit sunburned. The UV has been quite high lately, higher than is normal for the season, I would say, so that's probably why you're going to see quite a lot of sunburn today, even in things that don't usually suffer from it. But otherwise it's reasonably healthy. All the mature leaves seem to have stood up pretty well, and it does look like there's a couple of more new leaves coming in there, so I'm not too worried. And our little bay laurel is looking more or less exactly as it was last week. That's going to be a recurring theme today because we're very much going into the inactivity period for a lot of trees now. Our little tree hibiscus coming in here is also in very much the same state. The growth point is still there, still healthy, just not currently growing, but overall it's looking quite happy. And our little soursop, Annona muricata, is continuing to show some new growth from one of its growing points, whereas the rest, with the exception of one possibly, have all become dormant. The only really active growth tip on this little Bauhinia petersiana has very much turned off for the winter. I'm not sure if that's heat damage or caterpillar damage, but it is doing nothing currently. But the plant overall is looking more or less how I'd expect, so all these leaves will probably drop off and then be replaced by some more as it warms up in a few months' time. Here's a little tree that isn't going to be dropping all its leaves off, hopefully. So this is our Washingtonia foliifera. It's coming up slowly, but it is coming up, and that central leaf is still nice and firm. And a little rain tree, which we do keep an eye on, even though it wasn't planted. It just popped up where I was going to plant a tree one day, as this is Philodendron violacea. It is somewhat stuck at this point, so it's been sunburned, it's been buried by mole rats, and now it is the time of year when this family usually goes fairly inactive. There is a little tiny growth point trying to come up there, but we'll see if that actually does anything before everything turns off for winter. And a tree that shouldn't drop all its leaves, although it probably will slow down its growth quite markedly in winter. This little jackfruit here actually has 2 stems now, and both of them seem to have active growing tips, which is really good to see. And another one that's going to drop all its leaves for winter, although you probably won't really be able to notice, is this Euphorbia tiricalia. It's already dropped most of its leaves, but it'll carry on photosynthesizing with its stems whenever there's enough light and warmth for it to do that. So I'm not really worried about it. It's looking pretty healthy. And down in here we have a little Cyagrus who has really not thrived so far, and has again suffered a little bit more sunburn just to make its life less fun. Its central leaf is still pretty floppy, which I'm not thrilled about, and its support leaf is, yeah, pretty sunburned, but I've given it some more water and hopefully it will start perking up eventually. Its sibling, as per usual, is looking in a slightly better state than it, but still doing absolutely nothing. It actually seems to have changed slightly in that it seems more water stressed than previously, even though again it has had some water yesterday. And deep in here we have a tragic little stick, which is the remains of a Aparinary capensis. The ones I did put in pots that I thought had died have recently started to show some signs of activity, so I am going to keep a little bit of hope on this because they have regenerated quite surprisingly, some of them from the bases, but so far no sign of that here. And probably the most cheerful part of this planting is this little Phoenix reclinata, who is nice and firm in the middle, nice and green on the leaves there, so I'm happy with that. And our Bauhinia blakeiana has produced a new growing point, although I'm not sure it's entirely healthy. It's a rather atypical colour, but it is growing, and that is a good sign, so I'm happy with that. The various saplings that went in for this waterberry planting are in various states of wellness. So this one has got some lovely new growth on it, a little bit of damage there, which looks like insect damage rather than sunburn. This one again has a nice growing tip coming up. This little one is trying to get some growing in. It's still much more delicate than the other two, and it was looking pretty tragic yesterday before I watered it. And this one is continuing to show no sign of life or regeneration. In a continued display of the value of weeds, this lovely little lychee tree is actually looking pretty good in its little thicket here of annual weeds. The leaves are nice and firm. There isn't new growth at the moment, but there isn't any serious sunburn. There's a little bit of blotching, which I suspect is a little bit of heat stress from where the sun has hit wet leaves when they've been covered in dew. But generally speaking, they're a nice texture. They're not unhealthy. Its sibling is in a pretty similar state, but with a couple of growth points still looking like they might do something still this year. And they went in with another Artocarpus heterophyllus, the jackfruit, which is, yeah, looking reasonable. I was hoping we were going to see a little bit more opening from that sort of top sheath, but so far it seems to be fairly static. But it's not an unhealthy little sapling, especially for how exposed this is for jackfruit. I'm happy with that. So next up we have this little Pachira glabra. You can see these two leaves have been stitched together, but they seem to be still reasonably healthy despite a little bit of nibbling at the top by whatever did the stitching. And there is a nice little new leaf coming down there. Its sibling is enjoying the benefits of slightly more shelter and looking significantly perkier. This tender young leaf is not burnt at all, so I'm really happy there. And this one is also in a relatively sheltered spot, and you can see that it is enjoying that, so I'm happy there. Next up we have an oil palm who is coming up alright. I would say the central leaf is nice and firm, even if it is a bit wonky, and I'm quite happy with that. And its sibling in a slightly more sheltered spot is also looking pretty good. Central leaf nice and firm. This one that opened up previously, which I think was just opening when we put it in, is looking good and healthy and tending towards the adult form, so that's really good to see. So next up we have Rolf, our little Revolfia, which is the wild quinine, who is looking generally good. He was a little droopy yesterday, but his growth points have really perked up with a little bit of water. And I would say he's generally in pretty good health, and his alligator plant, which is the Calanchotigra montiana, which is also one of the ones called Mother of Millions, is coming into flower, which will be lovely to see. Next up, and in more sun than is really ideal for it, we have the Easter Sunday Carpentaria, which is one of the very slender Australian palms, and it is actually looking alright considering how much more light it's going to get later in the day. That isn't ideal for this palm. Its central stem is nice and firm. Its colour is good. It was a little yellow when I bought it, so it not being any significantly yellower is good. In fact, in some places it seems to have got a nicer shade of green, which is really good to see, so I'm very happy with that. And this nice little avocado, Persica americana, is looking a nice colour. The leaf is a good avocado-y green, and the growing tip doesn't show any signs of sunburn, so I'm really happy there. Right, so I've managed to forget the proper name of this tree this morning. I have not had enough coffee, clearly, but this is what is commonly known as a pecan, and I think there is only one tree that usually gets that name, so we should be fine with that. And I think it's wishful thinking telling me that this leaf is about to throw out some new growth, but we will see in the next review, hopefully. Right, so this little soursop, which is an Onamira carta, probably went in a little bit late for exactly where it went in, because it is a little bit exposed in terms of sun, but it is not that exposed in terms of wind, which should mean it doesn't dry out or cool down too fast, and it seems to be appreciating that, because that little growth point there is looking very healthy, and that was the only one that looked particularly active when I put it in, so I'm happy with that. There are a couple more with life in them. So there's a growth point over here, which is there, it's just not opening up yet, and the ones that were here and on this branch over here don't seem active at all, but they didn't when it went in, so yeah, not too much of a concern there. Right, because we are in a tropical location, we can get away with planting a lot of tropical trees, but our winter sometimes makes them behave a little bit strangely. But hopefully this little Anacardium occidentale, which is the cashew, will not be dropping all its leaves, but it will probably be going into an inactive state. But it's really nice to see that it hasn't done that yet. We haven't reached the real cold point of winter yet. That'll be a few months down the line, but so far we have dried out and cooled down, but it hasn't stopped this one yet, so I'm really pleased with that. This one, on the other hand, which is slightly more exposed, does seem to have sort of turned off for winter. It does look like something might have knocked its growing point, but it does seem like there is still actually the meristem there, so it might just be the sheath got knocked off. But you can see from the colour of the leaves, these are sort of matured and sort of turned stale, I guess, for winter. Which is a shame, but provided it survives, it should be putting in some nice growth when it warms up again after winter. With a few more weeds around it, this one seems to have a healthier growing tip. And tucked out further out of the wind and closer to a line of old guava trees, this one also seems to be putting in a little bit of late activity, so I'm pleased with that. And this one deep in the weeds actually seems to have quite a good bit of activity coming along there, so I'm really happy with that. Now, they went in with this little Brazilian queen palm, Ceiba romanziana, who should carry on going up through winter. They don't seem to stop for winter, although they do slow down. The central growing tip is still coming up. It's just very, very slow to the point you barely notice, but it's nice and firm, so I'm not too worried. I am curious as to how exactly this pecan is going to respond to our seasons. Currently, this growing tip doesn't seem to be doing much, but we will wait and see. So, Baobabs do make me think that it should be spelled slightly differently. But this little one has dropped all of its leaves, which is perfectly standard for this species. A couple of our larger ones have more leaves, so it's taking a little longer for all of them to come off. But it's not atypical for them to behave this way at this time of year, so it's behaving normally. Its trunk looks healthy enough, it's a decent colour, so I'm not worried about this at all. Right, so we have another Brazilian queen palm looking significantly more like a Brazilian queen palm, so this is another Ceiba romanziana. You can see its central leaf is actually looking like a mature leaf, which is really nice to see, because it still has some juvenile traits on its older leaves. It does have another one coming up in the middle there. It's nice and sheltered here, so it hasn't been too stressed by the transplanting. It seems to be settling in pretty well. Its sibling that went in the same planting is still looking very much immature. I don't actually see a new leaf coming up here. This is the most recent then, but still very much juvenile leaf form. Right, and deep in here you can see a little jackfruit seedling, Articarpus heterophyllus, has been putting in the work, and we've got a nice little pale green leaf coming along there. You can also see a little mole hill where a mole rat has not had life all its way, because there is a little hole on the top of that, which is probably a little snake going in to see if there's anyone down there small enough for it to eat. Although it is pretty sheltered this time of day, this little lychee seedling does get a lot of the midday sun at this time of year, so I'm quite happy that it's not seeming too stressed by that. There is a little bit of burn on its growing tip there, but the leaves are a good texture apart from the insect damage they've got, and I'm reasonably happy with that. And this one is slightly more exposed, so it's not that surprising. It's looking slightly more sun stressed. It's not killed the leaves by any stretch, it's just they've got a slight discoloration as a result, but they are a decent texture still. The growth point does seem to have turned off for the year. Probably as the weeds come up again, it'll feel a little bit more sheltered, and it might put up a little bit more growth this year, but so far it's healthy enough, but it's gone into a sort of static state, which is fine. So as far as I know, Singapore has a significantly more tropical environment than we do, so it's really nice to see that even with that, one of the very sort of iconic flowers of Singapore, the Bauhinia variegata, the orchid tree, is showing some new growth even as we cool down and dry out. And next up we have this little banana in its happiest time of day, because at this time of day it is the least water stressed. Let's see its youngest leaf, which is not looking bad. There's a little bit of sunburn there where it's been overlapping with the Dracaena, and you can see actually the shell ginger has quite a lot of sunburn. This is one that was transplanted from shade, so that's not that surprising. It'll probably send up some more from the base, even if this stem does die. They're very hardy little plants. But yeah, it does seem like there's a little bit of getting wet and then getting sun on there has burned it, where it's overlapped with other leaves at various times. But the banana itself, a little bit of sunburn on its oldest leaf, but its two younger leaves, pretty good. A little bit of sun bleaching, but nothing serious. So onto this little phoenix, which did show some very serious sunburn, to the point that I was considering it coming off the list. It is actually regenerating pretty nicely. The central stem is coming up pretty well. You can still see the tip is just completely dead, but that won't regenerate, it'll just be replaced. We've got another one of the older leaves, the base that's still there, is nice and green. And you've got this little shoot down here, still a nice green colour. So I'm really happy with how this is recovering. Although it's less conspicuous, I'm probably even happier with this one, so I'm probably going to end up calling this little tree Lazarus at some point. So this is another Phoenix reclinata, and it had been so utterly burnt I thought it was going to die for certain. You can see it's pushing up these little green bases of these stems here, and so it's just pushing out its loving part. It's going to push that past all this dead growth hopefully, and then we will have some new leaves opening up. So that's really good to see that it's carrying on doing that. And the one that did show the least burning at the time, but is probably responding the slowest because it hasn't got the stress incentive to get over. We've got another Phoenix reclinata. You can see there is life here and it is coming up, it's just not doing it as quickly as the other two. So yeah, I'm reasonably happy with how it is, so long as it stays firm, so long as it doesn't get burned more. I'm going to be fairly forgiving if anything this decides to do. Okay, and in a more sheltered spot where it should be protected from most risk of sunburn until we're quite a long way into winter when some sun can get here directly. Got another little jackfruit seedling coming up. It's looking quite nice. The leaves are still soft and tender, which makes it really extraordinary at this time of year. I have been watering it. I've been watering everything, more or less. But it's really nice to see that it's standing up to the change in the weather even so. And its little Pandana's companion is again looking reasonably healthy. It's not doing that much yet, but they can take a while to settle in. Doing a little bit more, we've got some lovely orangey green growth on this little lychee seedling here. And despite some setbacks, you can see this one is also producing some new growth just up here. And even this one, which is the most exposed of these three, but yeah, still quite densely planted within its own sort of companion thicket. We've got some new growth coming right on top of this one too, which is really good to see. Also got some new growth coming on this little Bauhinia variegata, lovely and tender despite being very exposed in the midday sun here. Right, and just as I said it would, this little loquat here, which is Erebotria japonica, which is actually a Chinese tree, but that's a whole other story, is actually pushing up through this little kalanchoe that was planted to give it a little bit of shelter while it's small and tender. And you can see this lovely little green leaf coming up. It's a little distorted from pushing through there, but it's a nice colour. It's not showing any sunburn, so I'm really happy with that. And another one that can be pretty sun tender, but is looking pretty good. This is a little Suriname cherry. So this is Eugenia uniflora, and it's looking a nice colour, no sign of sunburn, so I'm really happy there. And its sibling is in a pretty similar state. And over here we have the first of our Dracaena studinary to go in this year. It's looking in a nice state. Generally there is a little bit of sort of dew burn happening on the corner of this leaf here, but generally speaking we're nice and firm in the ground there. They're a good colour. And then we've got a little Livistona chinensis, the Chinese fan palm, which should be a nice little understory palm once this area matures, and it's coming up nicely despite being more exposed than this species really wants. You can see a little bit of discoloration on the older leaves from a little bit more sun. This is the most exposed leaf too, so it's not that surprising, but generally speaking it seems to be holding up pretty well to the sun, and that central leaf coming up is nice and firm, so I'm really happy with that. We have another Dracaena studinary who is not quite so happy, but it wasn't quite so happy when it went in. It is nice and healthy in the centre, which is what we're really looking for at this point, and it does seem to be nice and firmly in the ground, which means the mole rats haven't had their wicked way with this. And here we have our little Kapok tree, Ceiba pentandra, very much modelling the standard look for the season of having dropped all its leaves now. Stem is still nice and green, nice and healthy looking, so I'm not worried that there's anything wrong here. It's quite normal for them to drop all their leaves at this time of year. Just I wish it had put in some growth before it did that. At least the barberry fig that went in with it is doing nice and vigorously, so, you know, there's that. So this is Mangifera indica, so it's another mango. It's one of the parrotbeak varieties, so it's a green one that doesn't really ripen very readily, so it's very good for cooking and pickling. And the leaves are looking nice, despite being tender at this time of year. You can see how soft these are. They're a good, healthy red colour, and so I'm really happy with that. And the central growing tip looks like it might even put out some more soon, so really pleased with that. Our missing Dracaena studinary is still missing. I will let you know when it's ready for replanting. But its sibling seems to be coping with its loss alright. The base is still nice and firm in there. The central leaves, they have got a little bit of dew burn in there, but they're not in a worrying state yet. This will rebranch from lower down if the top does die, but I'd like it if the top didn't. And usually with these ones I find the top won't that readily, but we'll see. Our little Madagascan umbrella tree is pushing up really nicely, so this little shoot has come up since it went in. So this will go up quite a way further before it branches out, probably. Although it is already sending up a little side shoot here. It's looking really nice and healthy, so I couldn't really ask for anything different. Another Madagascan tree, and another one that is looking nice and healthy and has a nice little growing point coming up in there. And this is a flamboyant, which is also sometimes called a flame tree, and that will be relevant in a moment. Right, so Robert's little flame tree is not looking in the best of states. It has, it seems, had the visits of a leaf-rolling cricket, which are not usually a pest. They're the family Grillacrididae, but they do tend to do a little bit of stripping of the edges of young grass stems, and that seems to have put paid to the top of this one. So it will have to branch from low down. It does look like it's making an effort to do that here. We will see if that opens up in the next few weeks. But the stem down here is certainly pretty healthy, so I'm not worried about it. It's just a little disappointing right after it went in to lose that tip. And here we have a little candelabra tree, which is Euphorbia ingens. You can see the flowers coming up nicely. The growth tip itself is relatively inactive at this point. Its three little yuccas, which are Yucca gigantea, are looking reasonably perky actually. This one's had a little bit of sunburn, but is nice and upright, so I'm happy with that. Its little sibling over there is looking fully upright and nice and perky, so I'm really happy with that one. And this one is just taking a little bit longer to stand up straight, but it's nice and firm, so I'm not too worried. And this little missing seedling is still missing. Right, so this little Brachystegia taxifolia is not coming up at all. A lot of our native trees will go dormant at this time in winter and reserve the water they have over the dry season for the warm part of the dry season, which is much more productive for growing for them. So I'm not too worried about its inactivity, but I would have loved to see some growth before winter. And its sibling is dropping its leaves one by one in preparation for going inactive, so I think we're not going to see anything here before sort of September time. We also don't seem to be seeing any activity on this little stump. So this is Kigelia africana. It is alive, that is a healthy colour of stump, but it did suffer quite a lot from sunburn and caterpillars, and I suspect it's decided to cut its losses and just stay as a stick until it warms up again. So I will keep an eye on it and let you know, but I suspect we'll be seeing no change for a few months here. Another one from which I suspect we will be having no change is this little rose apple, which I'm fairly sure is pretty dead at this point. It's quite loose in the ground now even, so it's probably just completely disengaged and just died, which is a shame. Yeah, even scratching into the trunk here, there is no sign of life, even quite a long way down. So I think this is just a stick, so sorry for that. Looking much better than that is this little macadamia seedling that went in the same day, which is coming up nicely, I would say. I think there's another growing tip in the centre, but it's quite dark in there, so I'm not sure. And we've also got some nice tender growth on this little custard apple, which is Annona squamosa, not showing any signs of sunburn or insect damage. They're not as soft as the leaves of the soursop, but it's a nice texture nonetheless, and so I'm quite happy with how that is coming along. And this little lychee still has some nice tender growth coming up despite the drying out. There is a little bit of sunburn on this leaf, or at least some bleaching, but generally speaking I'm quite happy with how that's looking. And its sibling from the same day is again looking pretty decent. There's even some tender growth coming along, so yeah, quite a happy little seedling. I think I'm pretty resigned to the fact that this little Philanthus emblica, which is the Indian gooseberry, amla or emblic, is not going to be doing anything before the next rains, so yeah, that seems pretty inactive, which is a shame. I'd hoped it would get some growth in, but it's a healthy little non-growing little shrub so far, so hopefully it'll turn into a healthy little tree quite soon. Another distressed little phoenix, this little one. Again, the central tip is firm and it's not too loose in the ground. I think there has been some root damage happen there. There has been some mole activity around here, so it might just be recovering from that. The parts that are alive are a nice colour, a nice texture, so I'm not too worried. It seems like for the state it's in pretty good health, which should help it recover quite well. And another little Cyagrus or queen palm. Again, she's not looking the best, but for the state she was when she went in, I'm not too worried. She was quite squashed when she went in. I will take off this leaf, which has now fully died. But it actually looks like something might be happening down there. But yeah, I'm not too worried about her. She's in a reasonable state and she should perk up soon. And every week I think I comment on how this one is a little bit softer than I would like, but it's not too bad at all really. It's just in a holding pattern. And Wyatt's little Heptaplorum actinophyllum, or Tricha flower, or Australian umbrella tree, is looking in pretty good health generally. I'm quite happy with that. The new leaves are seeming to settle out a little bit smaller than the original leaves, but that's not that concerning, and it should find it's a little easier to put out full-size leaves as the bamboo drops its own leaves. And generally speaking, it seems to be coping pretty well with a very low light level in here, so I'm happy with that. Right, so this is a little quince, Sidonia oblonga, and it's actually got some new growth coming along, and the aphids seem to have more or less abandoned the tips here. So I presume something predatory moved in. They did do a little damage, so these leaves are going to be a little bit misshapen for their whole lives. But generally speaking, I'm really pleased to see it perking back up. I'm also really pleased with this little Prunus persica, or peach, which also is showing the benefit of having some temperate plants, because it means you have something perking up as you go into winter, which is really nice to see. But it's got some lovely little tender green leaves come up here, so I'm really happy to see that. I'm also really happy to see this little Lychee chinensis coming up with some tender leaves just in here. This isn't very exposed to the sun, but it is quite exposed to the wind here, so it's good to see that it's coping well with that. Right, so as my sister called it, Pete's Dragon, this little Dracaena fragrans, is looking pretty good, I would say. It's not showing any of the flop that you usually associate with smaller, more tender stems. This was a more mature stem, so it had already sort of hardened off quite well. And you can see it's standing up nice and upright, and there's no sign around its base of any mole rat activity, which would be the real concern at this time of year, of them moving in and starting to eat away some of its poorly chosen companion plants, because all of these, again, are Dracaenas. Right, so our little Colophospermum mupani, Hamilton, has dropped all but one of his leaves, so he's not looking great, generally. He will be going dormant around this time of year anyway, although I would have expected a little bit later, and then regrowing once it warms up a bit. Hopefully by the time it warms up a bit, these little Calancos exangularis will have filled out a little bit, and that will mean that he's a little bit more sheltered around the base, and so he shouldn't be so prone to sunburn, but we'll see. His sister Aitken is looking in a much better state. And I will say she's had nothing different in her regime. The only thing that has been different is that she has been in a much denser little thicket. So there's been some native weeds, this is Bidenstepia in here, and rather than having the rather small Calancos exangularis cuttings, she had Cotyledon barbae, which is a bushveld cotyledon, which is significantly larger, so she was sheltered a little bit more straight away, and that seems to have really paid off for her. Most plants, even ones that grow in full sun like Mopani, don't start on absolutely bare soil. If they do, they'll start in a little crook, but they're a little bit out of the elements. So I really should have borne that in mind for Hamilton, but at least my planting of Aitken seems to have paid off quite well. So a plant that is much, much happier with how it's gone in, this little feltbush, Calanco behariensis, which is one of the tree calancos from Madagascar, is coming up really, really nicely. It seems nice and firm. It hasn't really had time to show any new growth since it went in, but its tender growth isn't showing any signs of stress. And it does seem nice and firmly rooted despite being quite loose when it first went in, so I'm really pleased with that. And another tree that seems to be regretting exposure a little bit, although it is recovering a little bit better than Hamilton is. This is our carrot trees, Diganotinia araliaceae, and again this is a very hardy tree, so I won't be that worried if it does drop all its leaves. It will come back, and it will drop all of its leaves at some point this year because they are fully deciduous, but it shouldn't be quite yet. But it isn't unhealthy on the leaf that survived the burning, which was the youngest leaf at the time, and it is trying to push out a new leaf, although its growing tip did get a little bit burned there. So hopefully we will see some growth on that soon, but for now I'm not worried about it. So as you might guess from the lighting, I forgot the Cereus trepandus, but it is fine. It just hasn't shown any growth yet. It probably will over the season, because as we cool down before we get into the winter proper, we should be in pretty ideal conditions for a lot of the cactuses. A lot of them really don't mind it getting a little bit chilly at night and warm in the day, because that's quite standard in a lot of the drier regions that a lot of these cactuses come from. So it should be able to put in a little bit of growth soon. And here we have a little Sibyllid mantis. You can see the little sort of teddy bear shape on top of her head. This is a nymph still. She will get significantly larger, and she'll get either green or pink wings depending when she matures. But beautiful little, very cryptic, bizarre little creature, very predatory, but beautiful. Anyway, she was just on top of our planting of this little custard apple, which is another Annona squamosa, who is looking reasonably healthy. I'm not seeing as much new growth there. There is a bit of new growth, and there is a little bit of die-off of some of the older leaves down the stem, but generally speaking it's in a healthy state, so I'm happy with that. And in the same little area under the sycamore fig, we have a nice little lychee, and you can see some nice tender growth coming up there. Really enjoying this sheltered spot. And down here we have Monune longifolia, which is one of the false ashox. You can see this lovely red tender growth coming up beautifully. And its sibling is also producing some lovely tender growth. This long-suffering little rough lemon, so Citrus ex jambiri, had finally shown some new growth, and now the woolly bears have moved in and eaten some of that. But it's not unhealthy, and it does seem like it's actually in a generally upward trend. and there's a couple of new meristems starting to open up in there, so I'm really pleased that it's showing some activity. So I'm not worried about the loss of leaves, because again, it seems like it has settled in and it will be pushing out and replacing that pretty quickly. And then our African olive, which is Olea europea, probably subspecies cuspidata, but I'm not sure because there are quite a few different species of Olea in Africa. It's got a little bit of discoloration, which I believe came from the nursery. You've got some lovely little growing tips up here, looking good and healthy, so I'm pleased with that. And deep in here we have our Cyathea, which is one of the tree ferns. I think it's probably Cyathea australis, but I'm still hoping for Drake. And it's got 2 new leaves coming up really nicely, so I'm really pleased to see that. Here we have our little Thaumatophyllum bipinnatifidium. This one went in before the other, but it was smaller, and it has been pushing up some new growth tips just in here. But it's still quite small, but it's coming along all right, so I'm happy with that. And we also have this lovely little Solanum batasium, which is the tree tomato, pushing up some lovely new purple leaves. I'm really pleased to see that's carrying on as the weather changes. And here we have Melaleuca alternifolia, which is the Australian tea tree. And you can see there is still some tender new growth coming in here, which is really good to see. And most of the older tender growth has changed colour. It's still smaller than the original growth it had when it went in, but it's hardened off to the mature colouring. So I'm happy to see that it's progressing normally. And another tree that is definitely entering its deciduous phase, we have our little moringa here. It actually has a little Aloides butterfly, which is one of the coppers, just there in the centre. Which is really nice to see a little bit of wildlife on this one. It is a great time of year for butterflies in Zambia at the moment. But yeah, a lot of the older leaves are going to be dropping off this quite shortly. But I'm not too worried about these because this is a very deciduous tree and it had put in some really good growth before this. So as long as it gets that done every year, it's not too much of a concern. Right, so that is everything for part 1. I'm going to be splitting this into 2 parts, so I will charge the camcorder and then go and film the second part. Thank you very much for watching. Please tune in again for part 2 if you enjoyed this. This will not be going up the day it's filmed, so please tune in again yesterday, the day before that, and probably the day before that as well, for the trees I planted since this went in.